Goedemiddag allemaal. Mijn naam is Raoul. Ik ben de zaalmoderator. Jullie zitten hier voor Why You Need a Design System.
Engels, dacht ik, maar oké.
Gepresenteerd door Adam El Hassan. Welkom. Even een huishoudelijke mededeling, ook voor de mensen thuis. Als jullie vragen hebben, het liefst bewaren tot het einde van de presentatie. Want dat kan Adam zijn presentatie mooi afwerken. En voor online, we hebben in de online sessie rechtsboven de Q&A tabblad. Kun je gebruiken. Ik modereer de vragen en ik zet ze uiteindelijk aan het einde van de presentatie door aan Adam. Adam, succes.
Yes, thanks. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining. Today we're going to talk about design system and specifically why you actually need one. I want to start off today by taking a look at Spotify. Spotify is a very used application. We can see they have different platforms they use, right? So Android, iOS, and web, for example, or desktop. Something I want to focus on currently is the green button that we see, right? So we see the pause button on the web, and we see shuffle play on Android and iOS. We can see there are some resemblances throughout the different platforms and throughout the different applications. And what does this mean? This means that this is part of a design system. And what does this do? This helps them with a lot of this has a lot of benefits for their development process and consistency, etc., etc. And I want to show you today, and I want you to leave this room today thinking, okay, why is this design system concept so cool, and why should I use this, and how could I implement this within my own project or organization, etc. Right? Before we get to that, let me introduce myself. My name is Adam. I've worked at several companies, mostly always focusing on React. I've worked at WeAreU, Synapse, and ASML, and I'm currently working at ASML as well for 1.5 years almost. I've worked at the development team for applications and dashboards, but currently I'm working at the design system team. So since I've made this switch, I thought it would be a good opportunity to talk about it, because we've seen a lot of interesting experiences that I want to share with you today. Next to work, I like to play video games, of course. We're still nerds, we're ITers, we have to play video games. Try to stay in shape a bit, and traveling is also one of my hobbies. But okay, enough about me. Let's get into the interesting stuff, because let's start off with what is a design system, right? Because to understand that, let's understand what a design system is, and after that we'll have some interesting concepts as well. First of all, in short, a design system is a tool that enables you to build applications, right? That's a one-liner, that's a design system. But what does it actually mean? It gives you one single source of truth for your applications or application. It could be used in both manners. If you don't get it yet, there's no problem. We have 40 more minutes. So let's get through it. So let's first explain why a component library, because a component library is one of the main concepts and artifacts of a design system, but it's often confused with a design system. It's not the same. It's a big part of it, that's true, but it's not the same, and I want to make that clear. Let's first, in that case, understand what a component library is, right? So a component library, in one sentence again, a set of components that is reused across different applications, or the same application, actually. Right? Let's go back to our Spotify example. Well, if we look at our Spotify example, we can see that we have quite some different, we have quite some resemblance, like we said, right? So this button is a component in our component library. But at the same time, it's also a component in our design system. But it's not the same thing, right? In our component library, it's something that we can reuse across our different applications. But in our design system, there's way more to it. There's way more explained, and there's way more documentation. We'll get into that in a second. If you don't get it yet, that's of course no problem. But I want to make clear that it's not the same thing. It's a different concept or a different part of the design system. The design system consists of way more than just the component library. And that is, starting off, of course, the component library, but there's way more in there, right? There's a UI kit, there are design principles, there's documentation, brand rules, purpose, examples for do and don'ts, a roadmap, blogs, new posts, newsletters, so there's a lot more in there, right? It consists of way more than just a component library. Let's dive into them one by one. And I want to start off with a UI kit. I'm going to show you a very simple UI kit of Spotify. This is, of course, not all of it. That wouldn't make sense. But the thing is, if we look at the right side, let's skip the blurred part for now. If we look at the right side, we see some different components, right? We see some buttons, a green and a black button and a white button. We also see some icons, and we see some controls like play controls and whatnot. But this is your UI kit in your design system. So these are the different components in your component library and your design system that you can use in your application and that you should use because the design system is a system that you should follow. So these are components in our UI component, but the interesting thing is the other part of this image are the branding rules. And design system consists branding rules as well, right? What kind of colors are we using? What kind of logos do we have? What kind of typography do we use? Right? We can see that the different colors and the different typography is reused in our same buttons and our same like playback controls and whatever, right? So it's reused in the rest of the applications and in the rest of the component library and the rest of the design system. So it's something that you should follow once again, right? It's a rule book to follow. Talking about rules, we have the design principles that you should follow once again. But the design principles is an easy one, right? It's straightforward. How does something look like? How is it designed? What kind of pixels do you have from the sides of a button or something, right? So these are very standard designing rules. How does something look like? How does something interact with the user? How does the user interact with the button? Right? These things are also in a design system. Next up, also something a bit less obvious maybe, but a design system should have a purpose, right? It should have a clear goal that you should have in mind while working on it, while designing it, while developing on it, while adding to it. And this could vary from one design system to another, from one company to another, right? Maybe your purpose could be really focused on branding. We'll see in a second how you could do that, right? Maybe your focus is really on developing as fast as possible or something, right? So it depends. You should have that in mind as well. And your focus will shift when you have that in mind, when you have a purpose. Yes, next up, do and don'ts. Let's take a look again at our buttons. Let's specifically focus on the buttons for now. Because we have a primary button, we have a secondary button, and we have a black button. But these buttons are supposed to be used in a specific case. Well, when do you use them and when do you not use them, right? So these are examples of do and don'ts. Let's first take a look at a very simple example that I think most web developers would know. A very simple example is, well, if you have just one option to choose, you should never use a checkbox. You should always use a radio button. We all know this example, right? It's standard designing principles in that sense. But there could be some more specific things to a design system because every design system has their own do and don't. So maybe a different company, I wouldn't know who would do this, but maybe a different company has the opposite do and don'ts, right? Maybe they want you to use a checkbox in a certain situation, right? So the do and don'ts vary from one company to the other, from one design system to the other. A bit more of a less known example would be when to use an alt property on an image, right? So these are a bit more specific. And like I said before, when do you use a primary, when do you use a secondary button? So these are also a bit more specific to a company, right? So it depends on that. But definitely very helpful information to have in your design system. Roadmap and strategy. So this a bit ties back to your goal, right? So your roadmap should be clear for a design system. And The product owner is going to play a very, very big role in this. We'll get back to that later in this presentation, but the product owner is going to play a very big role for the roadmap and for the strategy of a design system, because the roadmap of a design system should be clear for the developers of the design system, but as well as the users and consumers of the design system and the components in the component library, right? So this is also something that should be very clear. Blogs, news posts. Let's imagine your favorite game has a new update or something, right? Imagine from one day to the other, this update just comes around and you have no idea what happened and you're playing the game, everything's new. You wouldn't want that as well, right? So you want some kind of update or some kind of video or some kind of blog post, some kind of Twitter post maybe that tells you what are the new things in this update. So when there are new updates in the design system, it's the same thing. You want a blog post or you want some kind of email maybe or something that tells you what the updates are, so you know how to use this in your application or how to take that into account for your next sprint maybe, right? Next up, our favorite topic, documentation, of course. Because documentation, as we've seen, most of our topics have to do with a lot of documentation, right? Do and don'ts have to be stated, design principles have to be stated. So these are a lot of documentation things. When we talk about do and don'ts and we talk about design principles, Confluence or Gitbook is a very good combination with, for example, Figma or Adobe XD. So these are tools for your documentation of rules, for example. But we also have a component library that we talked about, right? This is not, you're not gonna explain your component library in a Confluence page necessarily. Your component library is something that you have to use in a certain project eventually. And for a component library, there are tools like Storybook. You can, of course, also use Markdown for specific guides, but Storybook is a very nice and good example to see how do I actually use this component that has been created by the design team, the design system team, sorry. Let's dive into Storybook for a second because it will give you a really nice idea of how it actually would look like and how you could visualize your component library, because a component library on its own is not an application, right? You can't run it or something. So something like Storybook will help you with this. If we take a look at the left side, we see a couple of different components. So we have button, header, page, and table, for example. So we're currently on the first example of button, and we see on the right side that it's a blue primary button in this case. Right? So this will visualize how your component would look like in a totally isolated environment, which means that you will know how the button will look like eventually when you implement it in your application. Right? So this is a very good form of documentation for your actual components and code and the component library. This means as well that we can see on the bottom we have different controls. These different controls, for example, this specific button you can change the primary, is it the primary button or not? You can change the size, you can change the label, for example, right? So these are different properties we know in coding, of course, as properties or parameters, but these are the controls for this button component. So this varies from one component to the other, of course. And it varies from one design system to the other. In this design system, you can change your background color. Maybe in another design system, they don't want you to change the background color because it's a set rule in the design system. So this also varies from one to the other. Okay, just to recap really quickly. What is in a design system? It's a component library, it's a UI kit, it's design principles, documentation, blog posts, roadmap. There's way more than just the component library. Component library is a very big part of it, that's totally true, fair, but there's way more to it, and the one cannot really exist necessarily with the other, or at least not optimal. Okay, let's go on to why you should actually use it, because that's why you're here, of course, right? First of all, provide consistency. Consistency is a very important, as we've seen in our examples as well. We want to speed up our development process. We want to focus on our hard and difficult UX problems, and we want to enable change for our applications. Let's first focus on consistency and take a look again at our example of Spotify. as we've mentioned a couple of times, right? These different buttons are consistent across all the different applications. But not necessarily only the applications. In this this example, it's also across different platforms. So that's also very cool, right? So it can be across different platforms. And it doesn't only have to be across different applications or platforms, it could also be in the same application. In one application you have an immense amount of buttons, for example, while all these buttons will look the same, right? And the fun thing is, as we can see, right, this button has a different label. The button over there has an icon, the button over there doesn't have an icon. So these, once again, are all kinds of controls and properties and parameters for your component. So in this case, there probably is, for this component, an option to add an icon, an option to change the label, but probably not an option to change the background color, because they are all the same, right? So this is kind of how that would work. But you will provide consistency. And why is that important? It's important to provide consistency for your users, because if you are a big company with, let's say, tens of applications, and one user has to use 4 of those applications, he has to switch from one to the other from day to day, then he will always have the same look and feel for the different applications, right? So he'll always get trained faster into using a new application as well. Yes, speed up development process. This is a very easy one because we have seen all the different components that we have. We can reuse in all kinds of different applications, all kinds of different platforms. But this means that you don't have to develop it again. This means you don't have to design it again. This means you don't have to design interactions again. This means you don't have to test it again, because it's already tested in the component library. So this way you will speed up your development process immensely, especially if you have the more projects you want to run, the more projects implement this, the more you're going to make use of this and provide profit from this. Sorry. Yes, sorry. Next up, something someone could say, maybe designers, especially in this case, could say, I don't want to be limited by a design system. I want to be creative in my designing, right? But a design system doesn't necessarily have to limit you. Because let's be honest, if we think about this, imagine you are a designer and you want to design every single button on a single application, every time, every page, every single button over and over again. You're going to design it, you're going to design interactions. It's going to get boring, right? That's not why you are designing. You want to design because you want to think about the workflow of a user, for example, throughout the different pages and throughout the different interactions. So keep designing the same thing over and over again. I don't think that's why you studied, right? You studied to do the cool things, to focus on the difficult UI problems and UX problems. So it actually doesn't limit you, it enables your creativity in a sense, right? Because you can focus on the actual difficult problems and not the easy repetitive work. Lastly, I think one of our most interesting benefits is enabling change. If we want to change this blue background button to this green background button, and we can see that this one has a bit more round on the edges, let's see how that would look like if we would use a design system and a component library, because a component library is very important here. We're starting off with the button, and let's see in the different applications that we have a first button that has used the design system and component library. We have the second button, which is following the design system rules, but has not used the component library. And we have the third one, which just went totally off-road, right? Which is not using the design system and neither is using the component library. So if we do this change in our component library, so we're going to change the background color and we're going to give it more rounded edges, what happens to our applications when we update it? The following happens. So the first one followed everything perfectly. He's going to get the changes in the latest updates directly. The second one, well, he's not really in line anymore. And the third one, like we said, totally off-road. So the thing is, if we implement this correctly, what does that mean? If we have 3 buttons, all 3 of them do use the design system and component library correctly as they should, and we update this change, then it means in one time everything's updated, right? So that's a cool thing. This is enabling change for all your applications at once, which also means a very good strategy for branding, right? If you want to change your branding strategy and your branding colors, your color palette, something like that, then this would be a very quick and easy way to do that. Right? It enables change very easily and quickly, which means you don't have to update every single application one by one, which means you're always up to date with the latest changes. Maybe it's design changes, maybe it's performance changes, maybe it's interaction changes, but you're always up to date, right? So that's why it's very important to always use the design system as well. Let's take a look at ASML. ASML has been working with the component library and design system for quite some time now, for a couple of years from the top of my head, but we've been through a journey, right? We started off quite rough, and we've been developing throughout the years quite good. And since I've joined the team as well, I've seen a lot of improvement, which gave me also some motivation to talk about this, because I want to share the experience that we had and the problems that we had with you guys, so you don't have to struggle with them. I've seen both sides of the spectrum. So I've worked on the application side as a consumer of the component library and the design system, and I've worked as a developer in the team that develops the component library and design system. Right? So I know the struggles from both sides, of course. To be honest, this is where we're really going to start, because what we just saw, like what tools do you use, what are the benefits of a design system, that's kind of general, not general knowledge, but we agree on that, I think, right? So where the hard part starts, that's right here. And let's get started with this, because this is going to be the tough part, right? So let's get this over with. So first of all, building a design system is not necessarily a technical problem, it's an organizational problem. Right? The difficult thing is on an organizational level, especially in a company like ASML, for example. We have 4 organizational challenges that we're going to focus on today. First of all, we have ownership. Second of all, we have allocation of time and resources. Third of all, we have our adoption. And lastly, we have our, third of all, training. Last of all, adoption, yes. First of all, ownership. Who's going to take responsibility and ownership of your design system? So we have 3 different types of ownership that we want to discuss. First of all, we have centralized ownership. This means that there's one singular team which will take responsibility in owning the design system, working on the design system, updating the design system, and making the latest changes to the design system, which could be helpful because there will be no loose ends. Everything would be clear by that one team, but it means that there could be a lot of pressure there, right? This one singular team is providing for all the other teams, all the other projects that have to use your design system, which means there could be a lot of pressure there. Another approach, the second one, would be that there is no singular team which takes responsibility. It's possible that we accept contributions from outside and basically everyone is responsible for the design system. Could also be a good approach, but it means there's not really one singular team to approach, and it means that it is possible that people will slack into contributing to the design system, which we'll get back to. Because in the hybrid approach, you have the same issue actually, right? You take away the little bit of pressure from the team because it's a hybrid approach. People from outside can contribute as well, but you still have this problem of, okay, maybe people are going to slack to contribute to the design system, and why is that? Let's get to that. First of all, ASML, we have one team. What we do is we have one singular team which is working full-time on the design system, right? Our team is called the Common Components team because we develop common components for the whole company, right? And we work with a hybrid approach. The problem with a hybrid approach, which we've seen throughout the years a lot, and I've experienced as well working on both sides, is that people will not contribute to the design system when they have to. In ASML, we've tried to set up this non-written rule of if you need it for your team, you'll contribute to the design system. If more than 3 teams need it for their teams, then will work on it as the design system team. What we've been seeing is that people need it for their team and nobody else needs it. But there is this very big loop in ASML to get something through and approved into the design system, which means we can do it after our deadline, right? That's what they say, which doesn't happen, right? So that's the problem that we faced a lot. People are gonna start implementing things themselves, and after a month or two, some other team needs exactly the same functionality, and then they are gonna implement it also themselves, because otherwise they wouldn't get to their deadline in time. So that's when you end up in a situation you don't want to, right? Duplicated code, not using the design system, and using the component library. So that's what you want to prevent, right? So this is something that we have been struggling with as well, but throughout the years we're getting better and better at this. Lastly, the problem is as well that people, if they want to contribute to the component library, they will have to be in line with our design system rules. And if it's not written in design system rules yet, they'll have to add on to the design system rules. Because the design system comes before the component library, the rules in the design system, sorry, come before the component library, otherwise you can't develop your component correctly. And getting something into this design system means you first have to design it, you first have to design the interactions and design the looks. It will have to go through several reviews. After that, you'll have to develop it. After that, there are some several reviews. After that, it has to be tested, and then it will be released, right? So it's quite a big process and a hassle, instead of let's just implement it in our application, and maybe later we'll contribute, right? So that's something you want to prevent. Ownership. Next up, allocation of time and resources. Like I said, at ASML, we have a full team working on this. We have 5 front-end developers, we have 1 UXer at the moment, we have a product owner, and we have a Scrum Master. And I can't stress this enough, but a design system is an actual product, right? It's a complete project, it's a complete product. You can't see it as a side project, right? So you can't put some people on it who are also working on applications, so they won't have full focus. That's not really gonna work. We've seen that in our case as well, because we've been shifting a bit from one work approach to the other. And that's how you should actually treat it, right? And the product owner plays a very big role in this, because the product owner doesn't only have to look at what are our responsibilities, the product owner also has to take a look at what are the responsibilities, or sorry, what are the priorities of the different teams, because our priorities are going to be dependent on their priorities. Why that is, I'll come back to in a second. Training communication. First of all, our documentation is one of the most important things, right? Because people want to follow your design system, so everything should be documented. People want to follow how do you actually use a component from this component library, that has to be documented. So this is something that we have been improving on, and there are several ways to do this as well. Confluence, like I said, is of course one of the things, and storybooks is also one of the things. But we've been seeing more and more and more people coming to us for questions instead of using the documentation, right? Because our documentation is not up to date or it's not good enough, right? So that's definitely something that you should keep track of. Communication. There are a lot of different, there are a lot of times when we have updates and we have to communicate that to our teams, right? And we've been doing that with more and more ways throughout the last couple of months. We started off with, for example, a Teams message on some Teams channel. Turned out not everybody is invited to this Teams channel, so they can't see the updates. Then we started posting on our repository as blog posts or as README files, sorry, as changelogs. Turns out not everybody has access to this repo. Then we started sending out emails. This didn't really turn out, we could kind of expect this, but not everybody reads their email, right? So we've been improving on this year after year. We've been having demos to tell what our roadmap is, so communication is a very big part of it, especially in an organization like ASML, where you have tons of different teams. We're working on tons of different applications at the same time. Training, next up. Like I said, storybook, very important because people have to be trained to work on the design system, right? They have to know how to use a singular component because some components can get quite difficult. Something like a button, of course, quite easy. You have a label, you have some icon, and that's it, right? But some components can get quite difficult with lots of properties, which are not always too clear, right? So that's definitely something people have to get trained for. So it's not an easy thing to do as well. And lastly, our roadmap. Our roadmap, like I said, is going to be dependent on the other teams, because our team is a team that provides a design system and component library for all other teams, right? For all other applications. So all these other teams are dependent on us in some sense, right? So our roadmap is going to be dependent on their roadmap. If their roadmap is to implement some kind of new, big, cool feature or functionality, that means maybe this cool, new, big feature functionality should also be in our design system and component library if it's not in there yet, right? So we'll have to develop it first before they can use it. So sometimes, or most of the times, we have to work 4 sprints ahead for them so they can start picking this thing up 4 sprints later, right? That's what I mean by the product owner plays a very, very big role in that, because she has to stay communicated with the other teams and with the product owners of the other teams, right? So it's definitely a difficult role in this case. Lastly, adoption, which is quite a short one, because adoption basically, we have quite a big organization. We've seen that still till this day, we've seen that not everybody uses our component library or design system. And in the start, I can't really blame them. Our component library was kind of basic and our design system was not really that good. So people were like, well, we're not going to use this because we're going to be dependent on you guys and we don't want that. So we're going to build our own component library, right? They still want to follow our design system because it's company rules, so sure. But they're going to build their own component library. That's, of course, double work, right? You don't want to do that. Turns out, eventually, we got quite a good product. So they changed over, right? So it's lots of money. It's lots of budget, of course, because people are doing double work. Lastly, we've also been noticing that nowadays people are switching over to newer versions of our component library. People are staying behind. So there's a lot of commotion there, but you have to know that it's a lot of promotion in some sense as well. You have to promote your component library that this does work, and you guys should know about this to use this. We've noticed that there are apparently a couple of teams that don't even know we have a component library, right? So it would be sad if they started working on an application, realizing later, oh, all these kind of components that we were using and building is already in the component library, which we could have been reusing, right? So that's something you want to prevent. Last message I want to give you is just use it, right? So you have to use the component library of your design system, otherwise there's no use to it, right? If you have an application and the users don't really use it, your client doesn't use it, there's no reason for you to build it in the first place. So the more you use it, the more you're going to profit from this. And the less, yeah, what we said, summarizing, the more consistency, more speed in development, more enabling of change, and you can focus on your difficult UX problems. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed it. There are a lot of more presentations today I've seen. Be sure to hang out for that as well. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Adam, thank you very much. I have no questions from online. Are there some questions from you?
Yes.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Arthur. Yes. You emphasized that just use the system.
Yeah, but it's there.
And a lot of people don't even know that there is a component library or don't know components in the library or in your design system. how do you communicate to the users of the design system what you have? How do you educate them?
Yeah, so that's where our documentation of Storybook comes in very handy. Storybook consists of all the different components that we have. So everything that's on there is what we can provide them with. And everything that's not on there is either not yet developed, so it could be on the design system, on Confluence. We use Confluence for all that kind of documentation. And if it's not on Confluence, then it's probably not on our minds yet. So in that case, we try to encourage people to also come up to us and tell us, hey, we don't have this component yet, or you guys don't have this component yet. This could be very helpful for other teams as well, because I've seen different teams use this kind of component. And then we're going to start talking about that. Then we're going to start that whole loop of, okay, reviewing, designing it, interactions, etc., developing, and then we release it. And our best way of communicating this to our users is through newsletters nowadays. We still use our Teams channel. We have a lot of contact with our other product owners of the different teams, so that's a role for our product owner as well. She has to know, in our case it's a she has to know what kind of components are in our library, and if another product owner says, well, we'll have to build this functionality, it's up to her to tell them, okay, we have that already, so please use it. So it's a cycle of repeating, guys, we have it, use it, guys, please use it, guys, please use it, which sometimes can get indeed quite annoying, yes. Yes.
Yeah, the product owner, I believe that will work. The documentation, well, I have my doubts.
True, true, yes. That's a good point. Alsjeblieft.
Thank you for your first question. Are there more questions?
Hi, my name is Joep. I've got a question. You had the example of the changing of the button from the blue one to the green one with a different shape.
Yeah.
My question is, how do you check if everywhere that you implemented this, it is correctly transferred to the new style, and if there is no differences between the implementation over all your applications?
Good question, because that comes back to whose responsibility is it to do this. And in our case, the general rule we follow is if it changes in our storybook, so in our component library, then it will most likely change in our applications as well. It's a rule we follow, doesn't always count, because there are some edge cases in which it doesn't happen indeed. But then it's up to the team itself that's developing the application, which is a different team from ours, of course, to tell us, hey, this isn't working. So those are often the questions that we get after an update. We're still developers, there are always going to be bugs, right? So after we get an update, they should give us some feedback, hey, this is working or this is not working, and if it's not working, then either they ruined it somewhere, or we ruined it somewhere, and we'll have to look at it together, right? So then it's a collaboration between different teams to get stuff done. Because eventually we're still working on, in the same company, we're working on the same application maybe even, right? So we're trying to release something eventually all together. So that's the important part. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Thijs. I was wondering, how are you building the design system? Do you use like the atomic design principle, or do you work from the bottom to the top, or what is your approach from that?
Very good question. I'm not sure if I can fully answer you. Currently, since I joined in, we've stopped adding in new components yet. In our Confluence, in our Figma designs, etc., since we are lacking a UX designer. We have one, which is upcoming. But yeah, sorry, I can't fully answer your question.
Okay. I have a background in UX design, so that's why I was...
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. I got a question. If I would use your design system, which contains of components and design rules,
Yes.
and I would use this in my application, how would I know that I use it correctly? Is there something like SonarCube over it, which gives me a percentage that I used it correctly, or how do I know that?
If there is something like that, I can't tell you. We don't use it at least, but our general rules are in our Confluence, right? So all this kind of documentation is in Confluence. How should you use a component? When should you use which type of button? When should you use which type of dialogue? This is all in Confluence, and we put that responsibility on the team side to follow this documentation as well, right? It's not going to be very difficult documentation because the design system or the component library tries to take most of the responsibility away from you. So the only thing you have to do is actually use the components and implement the actual logic of the application. So we are just a view. We try to display just the different components, different buttons, dialogues, layouts, views, etc., etc. Right? So to some degree, we put that responsibility on them. And to some degree, depending on the component, the responsibility is on our side. And whether it's going correctly or not, once again, is a total collaboration of different teams. We can't check that for them every single time, right? I hope that answers your question.
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Yes.
Hi. Great presentation, because big fan of design systems myself. If you could go back a slide, I believe.
One?
One more. Okay, two more, then I didn't know that one. There, this one.
Yeah.
So, before this you said if something is missing in the design system, add it. Add it to the rules, add it to the laws. Who do you allow to add these things? Because I can then see suddenly somebody going, well, I want the square button, I want the triangle button, I want this, I want that. They just keep adding, so the point of the design system gets kind of lost.
Exactly, and that's the thing, right? That's the whole review process that we have. So we can't just add in everything. There are several lead designers that have to go over a specific component that they add in. So if, according to those designers, we don't need a triangular button, then we're not going to add a triangular button, right? So that's why we have this long loop and process of reviewing different components, because otherwise it would indeed be some kind of spaghetti, right? And that's not what we want, eventually. We want one consistent pack to use, indeed.
And what if they then go above your head and go like, well, your manager told us this?
Yeah, if it goes above your head, that's a very good question. Then it's not our responsibility, I guess, in that case. Then it's a higher management thing, yeah. But generally, it's total collaboration, and there's some trust you have to have in your colleagues, I guess, right? So, yeah.
Thank you as well for the presentation. I also have a question about how do you handle breaking changes? So I've used it at the Rabobank design systems, also at the police now. And one of the big problems was that if you introduce with the design system a breaking change, are you going to version in it? So some teams are using an old version of the design system, or are you going to just say like next week everything has to be according to the new breaking change? How are you handling that at ASML?
Yeah, very good question. I'm going to be careful with what I say depending on what I can say and cannot say, but we have been improving on this to generally not try to improve or introduce breaking changes, because we have been doing that for quite some time before, and we noticed that a lot of people gave us a lot of feedback about it. So we've been trying to do that less and less. But we've also been noticing that our components are getting more difficult and less logical to implement and use. So we've kind of started to find the middle ground in, okay, when do we introduce a breaking change and when not? And how to make sure that people follow it depends on the application. If it's a less important application at that moment, then we'll keep it, then it's their responsibility. If we are working on a very important application that has to be out by a certain time or something, then we try to put that responsibility on ourselves to dive into this application and update the breaking changes ourselves. So we're trying to find a middle ground in that, but depending on the application, either we do it or we let the team be free in that. And it does indeed happen that people are on version 4 while we are on version 20. right? So that's something you don't want, but in some cases, some code is just legacy, and at some point, someone wants an update, so then you have to come back to this separate, specific application after a year or something, so then it does happen, yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Some more questions? Otherwise, it's time, 3 o'clock. Adam, I have something for you.
Oh. Well, I wonder.
Small present for you. It's for you.
Thank you a lot.
Yeah. Thank you very
Thank you.
much. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. And thank you.